and Zambia has rejected it because it will contaminate the maize in the country, and it will also affect its future trade with Europe. That's a problem. The problem that we have now is that if you have a mechanism, you have to have the capacity to enforce it. If somebody told me that I think some of the documents that are presented to you are more than 1,000 pages, and you have to have capacity in different fields. They can be GM crops or GM other things. So basically we do not have the capacity to screen the introduction of GM crops. That's why in most African, the story is the same for most African countries, and that's a problem.
I think what Milind just said about these 1,000 pages requiring 500 scientific disciplines is part of the trick. Because normally, when any new technology is introduced, the costs of assessing risks should be on the one who introduces that technology. So in fact, in my view, there should be a tax on every GMO crop, a safety tax, which then finances the ability of third world countries to go to independent labs and have the stuff tested. And there now are independent labs created by some of the leading scientists who, when they realized what GMOs were doing, said we can't be part of this promotion, and they've used their skills to set up independent testing labs. Like there's a genetic ID lab, which we have used to stop the flooding of GM corn and soya during cyclones in terms of food relief, and then we had it banned. Once we could prove it had GM ingredients, which were illegal in India, we could have it banned. BT cotton was the only crop introduced in India. Now we have a BT eggplant, and this is our little campaign. It's called brinjal. India is the home of aubergine and brinjal. We have 1,500 varieties. The approval was rushed in half a day's notice with these same 1,000 pages. Most of it is rubbish, but they just want to drown you so that they can then prevent you from reading. 3 of the experts on the committee said the time was too short. An earlier assessment of these tests had shown that they are very, very unreliable. Now we are finding that 3 panelists on the panel are the very people who are doing this genetic engineering of brinjal for Monsanto. So you have you've got the thief as the policeman. And this conflict of interest is at the heart of issues. Your European Food Safety Authority is totally stocked by Monsanto people. And they constantly approve things that at national level, some governments are saying we don't want it. The EFSA keeps saying it's safe. But it's saying it's safe because Monsanto men sit in EFSA. It's a new authority created largely for giving approvals to GMO. So the politics of safety is a very, very important aspect. I'm old enough and long enough in this to know that in '92, when we got the Convention on Biological Diversity signed, but with the biosafety aspect, President Bush Sr. walked away, refused to sign it, and said, I will not allow my biotech industry to be regulated by the United Nations. In the US, they then passed an order, which is called the substantial equivalence. And substantial equivalence says, assume a genetically engineered food is equal to the non-genetically engineered food, and since the non-genetically engineered food has had no harm, therefore assume that this is safe. And I call it the don't look, don't see policy. You don't look for risks, therefore you don't find the risks. Now, US has never allowed labeling of its GM crops and foods. There's no labeling law. In India, we did get a labeling law drafted. It was about to be passed into an act. Pressure was brought by the US Embassy. It is still sitting in cold storage while all these new crops are being attempted to be introduced. So labeling is a very, very vital instrument for citizens being able to make a choice Do they want to eat the GM food or don't they want to eat the GM food, given that most of it is untested and the few places where the tests get done get hounded and those labs get destroyed and the scientists are thrown out of work?
Yeah, that reminds me of a campaign that we did 10 years ago probably, and it said the headline that we used in a series of ads was "Untested, Unlabeled, and You're Eating It." And that still applies, exactly. I want to move a bit into this talk of, advocates of GM now would probably say, well, this is all fine and well and good, but climate change, we are in such an urgent situation that there may be downfalls with GM. But because of the imperative of climate change, we have to just accept some of these downsides, and or we've improved them in what's known as they refer to as the second generation of GM. And I just thought, especially Ali, if you could comment on some of these, I'll ask some more specific things. But one thing in all of this too that I just wanted to point out, as I'm sure we all know, but to say that. This claim, at least in the case of release of nitrous oxide emissions, it cannot be addressed at all by GM crops. Nitrous oxide emissions, it's the most potent greenhouse gas. 60% of emissions come from industrial agriculture and primarily from the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Now, GM crops do not address this, and in fact, they require and aggravate even more sometimes of the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So even if we assume that some of these other issues were taken care of, but I want us to comment on whether in fact they are or not, this issue of nitrous oxide emissions is huge and deadly and potent, and to me is a very big rallying call for food and farm movements of something that we could actually fix this part without GM, over a short period of time and reduce a very potent and majority of a very potent greenhouse gas. But Ali, could you comment some more on this so-called second generation, if in fact what improvements may have been made? Are they just have a glossier finish? Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I think you're right when you say that they just have a glossier finish, and a lot of these methods and new products primarily that are being proposed are in fact nothing more than rhetorical kind of moves. But concretely, to talk about a few of the specific things, for example, there's what's been labeled gene stacking, which is using multiple different kinds of transgenic traits. So now they're being commercialized plants that have both BT production and Roundup tolerance and all of these and different promises of higher yield. So putting in multiple different single gene traits and creating products that are more expensive, and this I think is important to remember, because when we're thinking about these, we need to really integrate both the biological, economic, political, and social together. So by putting in multiple traits into a plant, the product that the various biotechnology companies are selling has a much higher price. There's other proposals, shall we call them, that claim to increase the safety of GMOs, such as localizing the production of the transgenic protein. So instead, as Dr. Shiva pointed out, where the BT toxin is produced in every cell, producing it in only certain cells that target the various pests, or expressing various transgenes through stress, which is definitely a much more propagandistic promise. And then there's a whole issue, and this is actually my specific concentration in my work, is contamination from transgenic plants into native species and other kinds of plants.